Preface. Rana, whose easygoing mind was the exact antithesis to the intense earnestness of Ghazali, called him the most original mind among Arabian philosophers. 1. Notwithstanding this, his fame as a philosopher has been greatly overshadowed by Avicenna, his predecessor, and Averroes, his successor and opponent. It is a significant fact that the Encyclopaedia Britannica devotes 5 columns to each of the others and only a column and a half to Ghazali. Yet it is doubtful whether it is as a philosopher that he would have wished to be chiefly remembered. Several of his works, it is true, are polemics against the philosophers, especially his Tedafat al-Falasifa, or Destruction of the Philosophers, and, as Solomon Monk says in his Mélanges de philosophique et arabe, Ghazali dealt a fatal blow to Arabian philosophy in the East, from which it never recovered, though it revived for a while in Spain and culminated in Averroes. Philosopher and skeptic as he was by nature, Ghazali's chief work was that of a theologian, moralist, and mystic, though his mysticism was strongly balanced by common sense. He had, as he tells us in his Confessions, experienced conversion. God had arrested him on the edge of the fire, and thenceforth what Browning says of the French poet, René Jean Allum, was true of him. Human praises scare. Rather than soothe ears all a tingle yet. With tones few hear and live, and none forget. In the same work he tells us that one of his besetting weaknesses had been the craving for applause, and in Ihya Ulum, Revival of the Religious Sciences, he devotes a long chapter to the dangers involved in a love of notoriety and the cure for it. After his conversion, he retired into religious seclusion for 11 years at Damascus. A corner of the mosque there still bears his name, the Ghazali Corner, in Jerusalem, where he gave himself up to intense and prolonged meditation. But he was too noble a character to concentrate himself entirely on his own soul and its eternal prospects. The request of his children, and other family affairs of which we have no exact information, caused him to return home. Besides this, the continued progress of the Ismailians connected with the famous assassins, the spread of irreligious doctrines, and the increasing religious indifference of the masses not only filled Ghazali and his Sufi friends with profound grief, but determined them to stem the evil with the whole force of their philosophy, the ardor of vital conviction, and the authority of noble example. In his autobiography referred to above, Ghazali tells us that, after emerging from a state of Puranic, the doctrines of a school of ancient extreme skeptics who suspended judgment on every proposition, skepticism, he had finally arrived at the conclusion that the mystics were on the right path and true arfan, or knowers of God, too. But in saying this he meant those Sufis whose mysticism did not carry them into extravagant utterances like that of Mansur Halaj, who was crucified at Baghdad, AD 922, for exclaiming, "I am the truth," or God. In his Ihya Ulum, Ghazali says, the matter went so far that certain persons boasted of a union with the deity, and that in his unveiled presence they beheld him and enjoyed familiar converse with him, saying, "Thus it was spoken unto us, and thus we speak." Bayezid Bastami, OBAD 875, is reported to have exclaimed, "Glory be to me." This style of discourse exerts a very pernicious influence on the common people. Some husbandmen, indeed, letting their farms run to waste, set up similar pretensions for themselves, for human nature is pleased with maxims like these, which permit one to neglect useful labor with the idea of acquiring spiritual purity through the attainment of certain mysterious degrees and qualities. This notion is productive of great injury, so that the death of one of these foolish babblers would be a greater benefit to the cause of true religion than the saving alive often of them. For himself, Ghazali was a practical mystic. His aim was to make men better by leading them from a merely notional acquiescence in the stereotyped creed of Islam to a real knowledge of God. The first 4 chapters of the Alchemy of Happiness are a commentary on the famous verse in the Hadiths, traditional sayings of Muhammad, "He who knows himself knows God." He is especially scornful of the parrot-like repetition of orthodox phrases. thus alluding to the almost hourly use by Mohammedans of the phrase, "I take refuge in God, Na'udhu billah," Ghazali says, in the Ihya Ulum. Satan laughs at such pious ejaculations. Those who utter them are like a man who should meet a lion in a desert, while there is a ford at no great distance, and when he sees the evil beast, should stand exclaiming, "I take refuge in that fortress," without moving a step towards it. What will such an ejaculation profit him? In the same way, the mere exclamation, "I take refuge in God," will not protect thee from the terrors of his judgment unless thou really take refuge in him. It is related of some unknown Sufi that when asked for a definition of religious sincerity, he drew a red-hot piece of iron out of a blacksmith's forge and said, "Behold it." This red-hot sincerity is certainly characteristic of Ghazali, and there is no wonder that he did not admire his contemporary, Omar Khayyam. The little picture of the lion and the ford in the above passage is a small instance of another conspicuous trait in Ghazali's mind, his turn for allegory. Emerson says, "Whoever thinks intently will find an image more or less luminous rise in his mind." In Ghazali's writings, many such images arise, some grotesque and some beautiful. His allure of the soul as a fortress beleaguered bv the armies of Satan is a striking anticipation of the holy war of Bunyan. The greatest of all the Sufi poets, Jalaluddin Rumi, born a century after Ghazali's death, AD 1207, has paid him the compliment of incorporating several of these allegories which occur in the Ihya into his own Masnavi, such as the famous one of the Chinese and Greek artists, which runs as follows. Once upon a time, the Chinese having challenged the Greeks to a trial of skill in painting, the Sultan summoned them both into edifices built for the purpose directly facing each other, and commanded them to show proof of their art. The painters of the two nations immediately applied themselves with diligence to their work. The Chinese sought and obtained of the king every day a great quantity of colors, but the Greeks not the least particle. Both worked in profound silence, until the Chinese, with a clangor of cymbals and of trumpets, announced the end of their labors. Immediately the king, with his courtiers, hastened to their temple, and there stood amazed at the wonderful splendor of the Chinese painting and the exquisite beauty of the colors. But meanwhile the Greeks, who had not sought to adorn the walls with paints, but labored rather to erase every color, drew aside the veil which concealed their work. Then, wonderful to tell, the manifold variety of the Chinese colors was seen still more delicately and beautifully reflected from the walls of the Grecian temple, as it stood illuminated by the rays of the midday sunday. This parable, of course, illustrates the favorite Sufi tenet that the heart must be kept pure and calm as an unspotted mirror. Similarly, the epilogue of the elephant in the dark, v. Chapter 2, has been borrowed by Jalaluddin Rumi from Ghazali. Another characteristic of Ghazali which appeals to the modern mind is the way in which he expounds the religious argument from probability, much as Bishop Butler and Browning do, v. the end of Chapter 4, in the present book. Ghazali might have said, with Blugram, "With me faith means perpetual unbelief, kept quiet like the snake 'neath Michael's foot, who stands calm just because he feels it writhe." This combination of ecstatic assurance and skepticism is one of those antinomies, fundamental and apparently unresolvable conflict or contradiction of the human mind which annoy the rationalist and rejoice the mystic. Those in whom they coexist, like Ghazali in the 11th century and Cardinal Newman in the 19th, are a perpetual problem to understand and therefore perennially interesting. He may believe, and yet, how can he? Another point in which Ghazali anticipates Bishop Butler is his representation of punishment as the natural working out of consequences, and not an arbitrary infliction imposed ab extra. He tries to rationalize the lurid threatenings of the Quran. In his own day, Ghazali was accused of having one doctrine for the multitude and one for himself and his intimate friends. Professor D. B. MacDonald of Hartford, after going thoroughly into the matter, says, if the charge of a secret doctrine is to be proved against Ghazali, it must be on other and better evidence than that which is now before us. At any rate, Ghazali has been accepted as an orthodox authority by the Mohammedans, among whom his title is Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, and it has been said, if all the books of Islam were destroyed, it would be but a slight loss if only the Ihya of Ghazali were preserved. The great modern reformer of Islam in India, the late Sir Syed Ahmed, has had some portions of this enormous work printed separately for the purpose of familiarizing the young Muslims at Aligarh with Ghazali. The Ihya was written in Arabic, and Ghazali himself wrote an abridgment of it in Persian for popular use, which he entitled Kamiyu-i Saadat, the Alchemy of Happiness. This little book contains 8 sections of that abridgment. Theologians are the best judges of theologians, and in conclusion we may quote Dr. August Thalik's opinion of Ghazali. This man, if ever any have deserved the name, was truly a divine, and he may be justly placed on a level with Origen. So remarkable was he for learning and ingenuity, and gifted with such a rare faculty for the skillful and worthy exposition of doctrine. All that is good, noble, and sublime that his great soul had compassed he bestowed upon Mohammedanism, and he adorned the doctrines of the Quran with so much piety and learning that, in the form given them by him, they seem, in my opinion, worthy the assent of Christians. Whatsoever was most excellent in the philosophy of Aristotle or in the Sufi mysticism, he discreetly adapted to the Mohammedan theology. From every school he sought the means of shedding light and honor upon religion, while his sincere piety and lofty conscientiousness imparted to all his writings a sacred majesty. He was the first of Mohammedan divines,